So am I crazy for thinking this? What if I bring it up and they don't react well, or like they get mad at me?
When you hold your feelings back, that's when resentment builds. And that definitely happened a little bit in our friendship when voice hugs started.
When things kind of get a little, that's when we're like, okay, see you later.
There are a handful of friends I would not have this type of conversation with, 100%.
Similar to any relationship, especially in a romantic relationship, if something keeps building up, if the socks keeps being left on the floor, the next time you get mad at the socks, you get so mad at the socks, but like it's never about the socks. And I think it's the same with friendships too.
The core of having these uncomfortable conversations is that you care about the friendship and you want to get to a place where you can feel good when you're hanging out with them and you're not holding these things back.
Welcome back to Voice Hugs, a podcast on becoming your best self and embracing all seasons of life with open arms. This is your host, Viv and Ro.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, friends. Friends. Today,
your shirt.
Yes, I purposely wore this shirt that says, "Have you hugged a friend today?"
Oh,
I haven't.
hug. Now we have.
Now we've hugged each other.
What a perfect shirt.
Yes. So, friendship is something that we've talked about on this podcast before. It's also something I've talked about on my channel before. I think one theme, I just realized the AC's on.
Oh, then turn that off. BRB.
Time to get sweaty.
Sorry, we are back from turning off the AC, but the AC is still on.
It'll turn off when it turns off, like friendships. No, I'm just kidding. So we've talked about friendships before, and I think one central thesis that we have, that we talk about a lot is, and like a lot of people online talk about as well too, is how as an individual in a relationship, in a romantic relationship, you will go out of your way to call the other person out and point fingers, and
I have no problem doing that.
Exactly. And you just do it so openly because it's like you're dating the person, they're a significant other, maybe you're engaged to them, maybe you're married to them. So there is this, I think like more and less is at the stake at the same time. Like, you know, you're with this person, so it's good to conflict resolve if there are conflicts, or if there's something that's bothering you, you will tell them rather than kind of brushing it under the rug. I think this concept is so, like, it's not new, but why don't we do this with our friendships? And I think the reason why we don't do it is because with most friendships, like platonic relationships, if you do get into a little disagreement, if a friend rubs you the wrong way, if they looked at you weird, or, you know, if like one person's just being like hormonal or whatever, right? Like it happens to all of us. You just don't see them for a few weeks, and then you see them again, and then it's as if nothing's happened. Maybe it's not big enough of an issue to want to bring up, or maybe because you don't want to seem like you're a demanding friend, or you don't want to come across, or maybe it's because your people pleasing tendencies kind of make you want to be loved so that you don't bring these things up. A lot of these reasons kind of stop us from, you know, having these tougher conversations with friends. Viv and I have been friends for
over a decade.
Yes, now.
Yes.
And it has taken us up until I think last year to
11 years.
Yeah, to have
Our first conversation
with a capital C.
Yeah.
We just thought it'd be interesting to spend an episode talking about how to kind of approach friendships on this level, or like start treating friendships a bit more like relationships.
How to have these uncomfortable conversations, because I think ultimately what we found is that after having these conversations, and when I say these conversations, I want to say like I can only count 4 or 5, which again says a lot about how often you have these conversations with friends, right? But I think after each time we've had these conversations, our friendship has felt so much stronger, and I feel like we grow as friends together, which is so like there's so much value in that, and it makes our friendship so much more meaningful in our lives. And so if you guys can do that too, imagine. And the thing is, I think all of us at some point or another feel some type of way about our friends, even if it's a best friend, right? Yeah. We all feel something, and most of the time we don't say anything because it's not worth it. We're here to tell you that sometimes it is worth it.
I think I can speak for both of us that we both haven't had these types of conversations with other friends.
I have with another friend.
Okay.
Yeah. And that friendship is also very special to me.
Aww.
Yeah.
I haven't had it with, like, the only person that I would have these conversations with is my significant other. Yeah, because I think the other friends, like, it's just not worth rocking the boat.
That's a good way to put it.
So anyway, let's unpack everything.
Yes.
Let's go back to the very beginning just to give a little recap of our friendship.
Yeah.
Where did we meet?
We met in college. We were 19 years old and pledging for a business fraternity. Yeah, I would say in college, like, we saw each other, but we didn't hang out consistently with each other. We were like friends for sure, but not like sleepover friends until a little later.
Yeah, we didn't really start hanging out outside of required, because you know how it's like if you're in the same organization, you will always have chances of running into each other. So it's like outside of that, and also outside of partying context. That didn't happen until 2016 or like 2015 after we graduated.
2 years after we graduated. Yeah. So we linked up in 2016. Ro had just moved back from New York.
Yeah,
her
like
first
the first
time in
time.
New York. Yeah. And I was in LA, and we went on a road trip together, which I think we've talked about this in maybe episode 1. So we can recap though. I think on that trip, something sparked in our friendship where I think both of us happened to be on the same page of, I don't know,
Personal growth, spiritual curiosity.
yeah, wanting to find meaning in life. We have always had really meaningful and deep conversations, even from the very beginning.
And we've kept in touch.
Yeah.
Like after, it wasn't like we were out of touch and we just went on a road trip together.
Yeah. I think that was kind of when things stayed a lot more consistent. Like, Ro had started her YouTube channel. She was in LA.
Viv was a massive cheerleader.
I was cheering
and
her
such a
on.
great friend throughout the whole process, especially the beginning where it's the most turbulent.
Yeah.
She would constantly remind me of like, Ro, you know, I know you're feeling a bit lost or discouraged right now, but just to remind you, you know, from what we talked about, this is why you're doing it. So like, keep going. And I'd be like, oh my God, you remember things we talked about. Thank you.
Yeah, that was, oh my God, that feels so long ago. But you moved shortly after that. Like, I don't even think you were in LA for a full year.
Yeah.
I think you moved and
Back to New York.
yes, back to New York. And that was when our long distance friendship started. So we actually had a long distance friendship for 9 years?
8
years?
Seven,
a long time.
6, yeah.
Yeah.
A good amount of years.
Yeah.
For
So
the majority of our adult friendship.
So with that being said, we're not going to get into conflict. You know, like
Yeah.
I'm not going to see Ro once or twice a year.
Yeah.
And not that anything bothered me.
No, like I think we would see each other more. Like every time I come back to LA, I will let you know and then we would hang out. But then even then it's like a few times, like less than 10, 20 times. Where it's like if you visit me in New York, you stay over, but then you're going to go back to your life. I'm going to continue on with my life after.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there was really no need, or we really just didn't have any conflict.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no conflict.
Yeah. Until
Until dun 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 dun.
voice hugs. Just kidding.
Voice hug shook everything.
Before we continue with the episode, we want to drop in and share something very special we've been working on for the past year. We designed a set of greeting cards with a hope to spread more hugs around the world, one handwritten card at a time. Having written each other warm and fuzzy, happy, tear-inducing birthday cards for the past decade, Viv and I realized how meaningful pouring our hearts out by hand in this heavily digitized world can still be. Perhaps it's the intentional act of sitting down and trusting ourselves to share deep gratitudes or even feelings we've yet to properly express in person. Either way, we want to encapsulate this hugs personified feeling for us all. Our first collection includes 5 stinking cute, thoughtful, and creative greeting cards that can be sent to your loved ones throughout any season of their lives. Wink, wink. You can find these cards on voicehugspodcast.com. Back to the episode.
Something very unique about our friendship, obviously, is that we decided to work on voice hugs together. And so we became friends coworkers-ish, right?
And like business partners.
Yes.
Yeah, co-collaborators.
And so there are different expectations and roles that came up in our friendship. And so also the consistency of us talking to each other, it became, I mean, right now it's like a daily basis.
Yeah.
I joked about this in season 1, but I was like, I'm basically Rose's second boyfriend because I know her schedule. I know anything that's happening in her personal life. I know when she's on her period. I know when she, you know, I know everything because you have to have that level of openness when we're business partners versus when you're just friends. You don't always talk about that on a weekly
And you
basis.
don't need to know necessarily. Yeah, so obviously you are the person I keep in touch with the most throughout the weeks. Yeah. Other than James, but I live with him, so that's a little different. But like we've talked about this before, I'm not a good texter. I'm not good at keeping up with people digitally. It's like I love in-person things, but also just happens that like I don't really leave the house these days, so it just kind of happens that way. But anyway, so even when we started quote unquote working together, I think something me and you both worked really hard to maintain is our friendship. Foundationally, we're like, none of this will be meaningful if we ruin our friendship. So I think that was the foundation of, for us to be able to do this thing together, we need to put
our friendship first.
Yeah. And I think looking back, we've definitely done that. Even when we would be stressed about work and, you know, hop on a call to talk about work stuff, we would spend the first 30 minutes to an hour catching up almost every single time. And I think that's something that we both value. And we would reiterate time and time again over the years that this is more important to us than the success of anything or just, you know, the podcast or all of that. So fast forward to, it's very rare for anyone to work this closely with a friend. Right. And
okay, hold on.
Yes.
It's one thing to work with a friend. It's another thing to work on something where it is so personal, where we're talking about our vulnerabilities and our emotions and our feelings and our growth and, you know, our reflections. Yeah. So it's like one thing if we were to design something and put it out there, there's another thing where the work that we do is personal. And then there's also that operational aspect to it of running a business, right? Podcasting, one aspect of that is the content that we create, but then the other part is everything else that runs that business.
Yes. So because we are sharing about personal stuff, because it is personal, because we are friends and we take it seriously and we take our relationship seriously, along the way, I would say like the first year and a half when we started Voice Hugs, things just cruised. It didn't cruise. Viv worked really hard to make sure every single week episodes would get up. She was editing everything. And I think over time, there were feelings that were felt that were not addressed. You know, like I think how a friendship starts kind of dictates the duration of how it goes, right? Like let's say, I think like a non-us example would be when I was in college, you'd have your group of friends, you'd have drinking friends, you'd have like all these different circles of friends. And especially when it comes to people that I just see when I go out and party, if they do something out of line, I'm just gonna whatever, like I'm never going to see you in any other context. So I'm just going to let it go. There's no point in bringing it up. But let's say if it's like a really close friend who's kind of like getting a little out of hand, I think I would sometimes gently try to be like, yo, get it together. Like sit down. Don't make a fool of yourself. But even then, like it's more like that's the extent to where it would go. It wouldn't go any deeper than that. So I think because our friendship started more as this very loving,
supportive,
yes,
warm,
understanding, yeah. Even though like you would know I was going through stuff or I would know you would be going through things, instead of being like, hey, let's talk about it, we would be like, hey, let's give each other space, because that's what we thought the other person needed
as friends.
Yeah. And sometimes that is what you need. But at the same time, like I didn't realize until maybe like 2 years into working that for you, actually what I said was for me. Like if I'm going through stuff, I just need space. But when we had a conversation, you're like, oh, if I'm going through stuff sometimes, like it would be nice to hear from you just so I know where we stand and where you are too. And then that was the first kind of light bulb moment in my head that I was like, oh, so next time, like I should check in or like I should follow up, because in my mind, I was like, she already has so much on her plate. I don't want to add more, so I'll just let her be. But then on your side,
Yeah, I think this falls a little bit on like the anxious avoidant attachment style. Not saying that like in that scenario it's anxious and avoidant, but for me, I need that constant communication or the check-ins to make me feel a sense of security, versus for you when you're going through something, it's like I need that space and I need time alone to reflect. And I think in the beginning, we didn't fully understand each other in that capacity because we had always been kind of like catch-up friends. You know, we didn't really have, or we weren't in scenarios where those things would come up. So I even remember in the beginning when we were first working on voice hugs together, if Ro didn't text me back for like over a day, I would be so anxious. I'd feel like, oh my gosh, I think I maybe should have texted this differently, or maybe she didn't like what I did, or I don't know, should I double text? And so I had that conversation with you where you're like, hey, I just don't check my phone. Feel free to double text. Like you don't feel bad coming to a phone with a bunch of texts. It's not, you don't think about it, right? You're sort of just like, okay, time to respond. Versus for me, I was like, oh, I don't want to double text. I don't want to triple text. But now I just
boom, 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 boom.
And I don't feel anything about it. So I think for us, it was like understanding each other on a very personal level first to figure out how we can communicate with each other. Even though we already thought that we understood each other on a personal level, there's a completely different level of truly getting to know someone when you work with them on a daily basis. Just like a romantic partner, you see this other side of them that you don't normally see when you're just catching up for lunch or when you're doing an activity together.
Okay, so there's something, a little tangent just came up in my mind. So what you're saying about like me not texting back, right? This sometimes happens to me too, where like I don't care that much, but sometimes it's like, it's helpful if, let's say, we've had this conversation and then we're also hanging out and then you're also able to observe, oh, like when I'm with Ro, she doesn't know where her phone is half the time. And like she's rarely on her phone. So then like that in your mind is like consistent in that, oh, you know, when she says she doesn't check her phone, she really doesn't check her phone, even when we're hanging out. So like that checks out, right? I think what gets interesting, it's like if I were to say that to you, but whenever we're hanging out, I'm always on my phone and I'm always texting people, that's when you're like, so am I crazy for thinking this, or do you not like me, right?
Yeah. And that definitely happens in friendships, right? It's like you say one thing and then you see them doing something else and you're like, that doesn't sit right with me. Like, what's going on? Do I say something or do I not?
Yeah. And I think that's kind of where this will come in, like, you know, this whole episode comes into of, let's say you do talk about it and it is a healthy relationship. Maybe you'll realize like, oh, like that day it was just like, you know, their parents or like someone really needed them. Or maybe, you know, sometimes people just aren't consistent and maybe they're not the best, most thoughtful friends. And, you know, like you just, it's always case by case.
Yes. I think the idea here is not to assume anything and to ask and come from a place of openness rather than make that assumption and then go into your head about all these other things that might come up. So I can't assume that Ro just isn't texting me and doesn't love me, but instead just ask like, hey, how do you feel when I text you, you know, double time because I want to? It makes me feel better when I like follow up or whatever. I don't know. That was not a really good example, but
no, but I think one thing that I appreciated was, had you not told me that, it would have just been something that I just did not know. And I think that's the thing with friendships and relationships and everything in general, is one person can be going through like, you're doubting yourself, you're doubting our friendship, you're doubting if I
want to throw up.
Right? Like you're like one person can be going through so much and the other person is just oblivious.
Yes.
Right? Especially if you're not physically together. I think if we were together in the same space, like I would be able to pick up. But if you're just texting someone on opposite side of the coast, and most of the time you're not with your friend physically all the time, right? Like the other person may not be able to pick up on it and vice versa. And so I think I've always appreciated earlier on, not even earlier on, like earlier on when we started working together on podcasts together or working on this together, where you would just be like gently, I guess, bring up these things where it was never like, how come you're not doing this? Or like, why don't you do more of this? Like you not doing this makes me feel this, right? Like that's a very different approach compared to what you just said of, hey, how do you feel about blah? Or how do you feel about blah?
Yeah. I think sharing how you feel in an honest and kind way without an agenda of changing the other person is a really good place to start. That way, you're not manipulating the conversation in the, you made me feel this way, so I need you to stop doing that, right? Or like, the way that you said this, like blah, 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 so don't do that again. That doesn't necessarily solve the issue. I think when you approach it from like, hey, this happened, it made me feel this way, and I'm coming to you and having this conversation because I care about our friendship, that's probably the foundation that you're referencing, right? It's that at the core of having these uncomfortable conversations is that you care about the friendship enough to have that conversation, and you want to get to a place where you can feel good when you're hanging out with them and you're not holding these things back. When you hold your feelings back, that's when resentment builds, and that definitely happened a little bit in our friendship when voice hugs started. Yeah. And to give context, I think like earlier when you're sharing people pleasing, right? Because we care so much about each other and our friendship, especially earlier on when we were working together, there was a lot of, well, I don't want to bring this up because they're probably going through something, or like, you know, I can handle it, like I can do it, so I'm not going to say anything. But if those things go unchecked and they build up over time, the reason why we had our first conversation was because I was at a breaking point. Like, I think there was a lot of personal things happening in my life, and I felt like I needed Ro as a friend. And that was never communicated. Like my needs were never communicated to her, and she just didn't know. Like you had no idea. And so I think like after having that conversation, it was a big learning opportunity for us in that I could have said something very early on. Like, hey, I need help. Or like, hey, I'm going through something. For you, it was like learning like, oh, maybe checking in would have prevented this from happening. And so a lot of times these things happen. We're not having these consistent open conversations that we do with our partners, because with our partners, we're like, well, the end game is we want to be with them forever, right?
Yeah.
But with friends, we're like, it's okay. Like
it'll work itself out.
Yeah. And my boyfriend says this to me all the time, where he's like, you're so much nicer to your friends than you are with me. Like you would never talk to your friends that way. And it's true. I am so much nicer to my friends than I am with my partner. And it's finding a balance, right? Like I don't have to be mean to him. I could find a better way to communicate.
Sometimes they deserve it. Just kidding.
But just kidding. With friends, yeah, it's just different.
Let's dive into the conflicts and how we resolve them.
Okay, which one? Okay, another thing is I have a hard time calling these conflicts.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a conflict, but it's like...
It's just uncommunicated feelings. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that build up over time to become something bigger than what they are.
Yeah.
And I think similar to any relationship, especially in a romantic relationship, if something keeps building up, if the socks keeps being left on the floor, if, you know, all these things aren't being done, then like the next time you get mad at the socks, you get so mad at the socks, but like it's never about the socks. And I think it's the same with friendships too. They can say something or do something and just completely trigger you and you blow up, and then they're like, what? Where did this come from? Not that this happened to us. This didn't happen to us. But it's just kind of like the cycle of how things happen. I think for the most part, with most of our friendships, when things kind of get a little that's when we're like, okay, see you later. You know, like you just want to kind of brush it under the rug and not think about it. And then with time, one person will get over it or both people will get over it and you come back together and it's okay again. But yeah, I think for us, I don't know. I think like maybe I can speak from my perspective of deciding to bring up or like initiate some of these conversations. I think fundamentally, you know, as you were saying, over time, as things build up, resentment can build up. When I say resentment, I don't think we like resented each other, but there's just like feelings that weren't positive. Let's just say it that way, right?
Yeah.
I think when you feel that, I think because we're so in tune with our emotions, I don't like feeling that way about people I care about. And so in my mind, I was like, okay, what can I do? Well, I can just, you know, me being avoidant, I'm like, okay, I just drop it. I can just leave it and move on with my life and never think about it again. And that's what I do with most of my relationship or most of my problems, right? Especially since growing up, it's just my default response to things. I'm like, it's too hard. I don't want to do it. I'm going to need to have all these conversations. It's going to be uncomfortable. I don't want to do it. But then when I really sit myself down and I'm like, okay, what is really wrong here? And like, what is the thing that I'm trying to solve for? And I think what it always comes back to is I care about you as a friend. I care about our friendship. I care about the work that we're doing. So if I remove myself from it, because it's hard to think through things when you're so emotional, right? And so when I'm able to take a step back, and I think this is why I need time to process. With time, it allows me to take a step back and look at things a bit more objectively and take emotions out of the picture as much as possible to just be like, what is really the problem here? Quote unquote problem, right? It's like not big problems. Like, what is the thing here that is making me uncomfortable or like that's making me upset? Moved, anything? And how can I approach this conversation as compassionately and as not confrontational as possible? Because it's like in my mind, it's already tough having these conversations. So if I like come in guns blazing and be like, oh my God, these are all the things that I'm happy with, let's talk about it, then like that's very different than like, hey, as you said, right? Like, this is how I feel. Can we have a conversation? Yeah.
You explaining all of that, you can just see how hard it is to get to the point of having that conversation, of like sitting down with your friend to be like, hey, can we have this talk about something? On the receiving end, I think a tip or something that has worked really well for us is understanding how hard it took for the other person to initiate that conversation in the first place. A lot of times when someone's coming to you and talking about how something you did made them feel a negative way or some type of way, it's very easy to be defensive and be like, well, you did this, well, you did that, right? And so I think understanding that, again, foundation is we want to work on the friendship and, you know, keep it for
forever.
Yeah, all lifetimes to come. How do we understand and remove our initial feelings of wanting to react, of feeling defensive, so that we can have that more open and safe conversation? That actually reminded me that, you know, we've been friends for 11 years and it 11 or 12 years, and it took us until year 11 to have this type of conversation. It was so hard for us, right? Like, even now, thinking about having a next conversation, which we will, it's like, I feel so blah. It shows that it takes so long to build trust. And I remember the last time that we had this conversation, the first thing I started off with was, I trust you. Like, I trust that wherever this conversation goes, as hard as it is, as messy as it might feel, I trust. And I've known her for so long, especially because we work together and the content that we do. I trust that we can find a way to overcome it and get to the other side. You might not always have these types of conversations with all your friends, but I think you'll know the friends that mean so much to you and you mean so much to them. It's so worth having that talk, because what makes it hard is that you're being vulnerable. That is the hard part. That is why we want to run away. That is why we're scared, right? It's like, for me, it's really hard for me to bring these things up because I'm afraid that if I share something negative, my friend will leave me. And it goes back to like fears of abandonment or rejection. And this is an example within us, because I had expressed, or she's learned from my experience of how I grew up, and she knows that that's an insecurity of mine or something that's deeply rooted. Even starting the conversation, a lot of times Ro will be like, I'm not trying to leave. Like she almost talks to me like a baby, like I'm not, this is not because I don't want to do this. But that makes a huge difference. And that's the trust that gets built over time. It's how do you show up each year, each time you hang out, being as true to yourself as possible so that the other person can see who you truly are. If you're not showing up and being honest about yourself, they're not going to know, so they can't help meet you halfway. That has been so awesome about this experience, is that it allows for us to be true to ourselves and true in the friendship, which you want to be in situations and dynamics where you are yourself. That's like your most authentic self is what makes you feel the best. And so understanding also that the other person is trying to communicate like, hey, I'm not feeling good about this. I'm not feeling like myself. How can we work together to get there?
So many good nuggets here. I think one thing that I want to just double click real quick is I think just learning from my relationship with my significant other, because James is also a bit more anxious. I think fundamentally it's like if you have these conversations, you're most likely having it with people you care about. So if you care about someone and you know enough about them that, like, let's say for you, right? Because I already know a part of you, if we were to have this conversation, would be like freaking out that voice sex is going to be over and that I'm going to drop our friendship. Because I know that, I will lead with, this has nothing to do with that. Voice sex is fine. Like, I love you. But like, there's just this thing that I would like for us to talk about. Same thing with like my partner, right? And I think that comes from a place of like, you're approaching this with vulnerability and also love rather than like hate and anger. Because I know a lot of times in movies, in TV shows and whatever, like people approach a lot of these things with hate and hurt, and because you're hurt, you want to hurt the other person. So I think like what you're saying with like the trust element, I think at the end of the day we both trust each other enough to know that if I were to present you with something or like a topic or something that's bothering me, I mean, before the first time I didn't know how you were going to respond, right? But I think over time, having had a handful of these conversations within the past months, right? Like it all happened quite recently, which is why we wanted to record this episode, because we're like, wait, this is actually so meaningful and people don't really talk about this, So I think like to have these conversations, you already need to have some sort of trust, and to continue building this trust and to strengthening this trust is when you do have these conversations, how the both of us kind of like react to each other. So I think like my hesitation in having these conversations with friends in the past, it's like, is it worth it? I don't want to ruin the friendship. I don't want to come off as, I don't know, that I care too much or that I'm insensitive or whatever. Like you have so much fear of like, I think similar to you, I have this deeply rooted desire to have everyone love me, even though it stems from very different things. And so I would never bring up these conversations because I'm like, what if I bring it up and they don't react well, or like they get mad at me, or they drop me as a friend in return because I did bring up some of these things. But when we did have our first conversation, I was actually very surprised at how openly you kind of just took everything and was like, oh, like I hear you and like I want to work on this together. What are some examples of what I've done that made you feel this way? And what are things that I can do so that in the future, like we can, it's like you're not going to change yourself completely, right? But that we can kind of be more mindful of like how we show up around each other and the things we do and the things we say. And I think if you were to bring up a similar conversation with me, I don't think I would have been able to react that way. I think I'd be like, what are you talking about? And like, I think I would get defensive.
Yeah.
I actually think I get really defensive. So for you to kind of embrace me, like bringing up whatever we brought up, I was like, oh, like it actually wasn't as bad as, because the stories in
way
your
worse
head,
in your
right?
head.
Yeah, I'm like, okay, she's gonna think this and she's gonna react that way. And what if she gets defensive? Then what am I gonna say? And then it's gonna be this huge thing, but like it wasn't at all.
Yeah.
And I think having had that conversation the first time, I was like, oh, it's actually not that bad, or like it's not as bad as I thought it was gonna be. Because I think we talk about this all the time, right? Like the stories in our head, we always play out the worst case scenario. And I think there's good and bad in that. The good is that they usually don't turn out that bad. The bad is that it holds you back from actually having the conversation. So I think going back to the trust, it's like the more you're able to open up to each other in this way, or as we have, the more that I feel more confident in the future that instead of it taking months for me to bring something up or vice versa, it could just be a quick, hey, you know, this happened, this is how I felt, it's no big deal, just want you to know. And you'd be like, oh my God, yeah. Because we can't read each other's minds. Just like in romantic relationships, you want your partner to know exactly what you're thinking, but like, it doesn't work like that.
Yeah, it definitely helps build confidence. And I think a good way to approach if a friend is talking to you, or if you're talking to a friend, vice versa, just trying your best not to take things personally, and trying your best to see your friend in the shoes that they're in. I think the nonviolent communication is really, really helpful. So I would definitely refer back to that episode if you haven't had a chance to listen to it. But it's really like holding space for your friend's feelings, but honoring your own. And I think that is something new that I learned in my early 30s. Before, if my friend came to me and said that, you know, like, oh, here's an example. When I was in college, I remember one of my roommates was really upset with me and another roommate for not cleaning the apartment. And instead of communicating how she felt, I think she was just really passive aggressive and like walked around and started like vacuuming really hard and all this stuff. And so me and the other roommate were like, oh no, she's mad. So she ended up leaving, and me and my roommate, we like cleaned the entire apartment. And then I went to the bookstore and I bought her a teddy bear and I left it on her bed.
Aww.
And that was how I resolved conflict. It's like so people pleasing, and it's so like, I will do anything for my friend so that she's not upset. Although that can be seen as like I'm kind or caring, at the end of the day, I'm not loving myself. Like I'm not honoring myself in my experience. You know, like I'm giving too much of myself. And so that ends up being the resentment that's built. Like, how come it's always I'm the one who's apologizing, or I'm the one who's doing more in the relationship? And so in my like early 30s, that's what I learned, that like, hey, you know, you can have these conversations and you can also share your side of the story in a non-defensive way and just be like, I didn't know that. That was surprising for me. I'm not understanding what about my behavior is making you feel that way. Can you help me find a solution, or can you help me visualize what you expect? Sometimes it's just that your friend is going through something too, right? And maybe in that moment, they can realize that like, oh, actually, I don't know. Like maybe it's something else. Like I think a lot of times we're all going through something and it bleeds into our relationships, right? Like if you're feeling lonely, then you're going to see the world as a lonely place. Or if you're feeling anxious, you're going to see the world as an anxious place. And so ultimately, all of this, it always goes back to yourself, right? It always goes back to like, why am I being defensive? Why am I, whatever. And so I'm really proud of us. I think these conversations are extremely hard. And I talked to like two friends yesterday trying to like workshop ideas for this episode. And they both had scenarios where they're like, yeah, this like pissed me off about a friend, but I'm never going to talk to them about it.
Yeah.
And they're like best friends, right? And it's just like, I think a lot of us approach life from a place of fear of being vulnerable, fear of getting close, fear of intimacy, because we don't want to get hurt. We don't want to get let down. In some ways, that is kind of like the core of Voice Hugs. It's like, how do we discover who we are and love ourselves more and be compassionate to ourselves so that we can show up in these relationships and build deeper, meaningful connections with other people? It really starts with you being vulnerable with yourself and you showing up in friendships in that way. That is the only way that we were able to have the types of conversations that we did. I hope that hearing this as an example just shows that how hard it is even for us to do that and how much fear there is. But still. But on the other side, it's so worth it, right? It's like we practiced what we preached, and that's freaking awesome.
I think every time after these conversations, we'd be like, oh my God, we low-key should have recorded that. But also, like, we're so proud of each other for being able to have these conversations offline and now also online. And I think one thing to reiterate is just we've known each other, I think, for more than 11 years.
I think so.
Like 13.
Okay.
many years. We've known each other for many years. Yeah. And it's taken us this long to have these types of conversations. And even towards the beginning of the episode where you brought up anxious versus avoidant attachment styles, we also weren't privy of these concepts until our late 20s, right? Like late 20s or early 30s was when we're like, oh, like love language, all of these things. And so it also just goes to show that these things take time. And it's okay if we haven't had these conversations with friends yet. But if you want to, it's something that we can slowly take step towards. And I think we all know our friends well enough to know that, you know, maybe with this one, I'll wait a little.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And then maybe with this one, like, she's a very loving, kind, thoughtful person. Like, maybe with this one, I can try with first.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would say there are a handful of friends I would not have this type of conversation with 100%. I don't know if I'll ever have that conversation with them, but something I also realized is that as I've been on my own like self-discovery journey or just trying to figure out how I want to show up in my life and in the context of friendships, I've gravitated towards very open-minded, kind, empathetic people because that's who I want to be. And so if I'm surrounded by that, it allows for me to show up more authentically as myself because I feel like I have a safe place to be me, right? I think earlier on, you're kind of just friends with whoever's around you, and that's totally fine. But I've learned that for me, gravitating towards people who are very in tune with their emotions or just kind, like very kind, open-minded people, that is a value that helps me build that trust with someone else versus some people I'm like, no, they will never understand. And that's okay.
But you still love them.
Yeah,
and they're still your friends. They can be your best friends.
Yeah.
But it's just the reality of life. And I think something that also comes with the territory of getting older. Like you just know that with some friends, it's not worth it.
It's not. And that's okay.
Yeah.
We're better off not talking about it.
But I also feel like there will be ways to approach kind of like, you know how like the people that I envy, the people who I look up to are just like the folks who can so casually just say in passing like, oh, like what you did wasn't cool. But then they say it in such a tone that's like, I love you, I respect you, you shouldn't have done that, but like I'm just letting you know. And there's like absolutely no weight around it. And then you see the other person like, or even sometimes when people say that to me, I'm like, oh, cool. Yeah, you're telling me something that I should or shouldn't do, or like maybe something that I can work on. But because of the way you just delivered it so casually,
it doesn't trigger anything in you that makes you feel like you don't know me or why are you saying like that? Yeah.
And I think that's kind of a mastery or like a level that you have to work towards that level. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to feel comfortable with your own feelings and your own thoughts in order to just show up that way all the time, speaking out loud.
What did you have for 302 for communications?
Girl, I don't remember anything from college.
Okay, so this is a college class. One of my college professors, she was like this more like old school business consulting lady. So like more traditional in the workplace, very professional, cares a lot about punctuality and just all of these things, right? So like first day of class, some people showed up late. She's like, never show up late, blah, blah, blah. But like she wasn't scolding you, but she was very stern. But I think there's this balance between like, you have to be very serious, but at the same time not, and you have to be very firm, but also like, I don't know, like there's just this magic mixture of things that like I felt like I was being told off, but I didn't mind, right? Because she just said it so matter-of-factly and it wasn't emotional, it wasn't. Anyway, I think it's just like there's this level of respect that I have for these people.
I would say that's a preference. I would say that that's something that you prefer in you actually, and I kind of feel this with us too, you actually respect directness. And so the more direct I am, the more you're like, got it, done.
Yeah.
Versus if I'm kind of like beating around the bush, it's sort of like just get to the point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that is actually a great thing that you brought up, because you have to understand how people like to communicate and how they like for other people to communicate back to them.
Yeah.
Like in my example, for me, like the empathy thing, the kindness, the soft, the warmth, like that is really important for me, because if I don't get that, if it's a little bit too direct, I immediately get into my head where I'm like, oh my God, they're so mad at me. They like hate me, blah, blah, blah. But in your shoes, that might not necessarily work for you. So it's like learning the dynamic between friends as well, in the same way as your partner, and like love languages. Our behavior always makes sense to ourselves. The way that we like things always makes sense to ourselves, but we are not the same as someone else. And so how do we flex our style, our communication with someone else so that we're meeting them where they're at, with the goal in mind that we're trying to grow, we're trying to meet that end, not product, but like we want to be good friends, you know? So it's like learning how to communicate with each person is going to be different. You do prefer the directness, right?
No, I think it's like what I was trying to say without like having to go on to this whole tangent, but like there was a story that I heard in the book that I'm currently listening to, right?
Okay.
Unreasonable Hospitality. There's like a story where a manager sees one of their employees come in with like a wrinkled shirt that wasn't ironed. And then because you don't want to rock the boat and, you know, be that manager, you just let it go for a day. And the second day he comes in, same thing, shirt isn't ironed. The third day, fourth day, a month goes by, you're like, this guy is out, like the manager's thinking like, this guy's out to get me. He like, you know, he's like doing this on purpose now, blah, blah, blah. But the whole time this employee like doesn't know, because he's just like, no one told me this thing, you know? But then in the manager's mind, it's so easy for us to have these stories about our head to like conjure up this thing. And so the example that the author gave was like, what you could have done on the first day is just pull this guy aside, be like, hey man, you know, your shirt's looking a little rough. That's totally fine. Why don't you go upstairs, iron it, and then, you know, continue with work. And then that's already like this is the expectation for at least like within the work environment, right? And then that can help mitigate that, like the pent up resentment and everything down the line. Yeah. And I think that is something that I aspire to be able to kind of share openly how I feel, like without overthinking and without making someone feel terrible about themselves.
Yeah.
There's like a very fine balance. I think that's what I was trying to say.
Got it.
But then what you're saying, but what you're saying is also very important, right? It's like understanding where each other's coming from and each other's communication styles and like how we are able to best take something in. That is just as important. Yeah.
Communication is literally like the number one skill, most important skill for like everything in life, which is really crazy because it's really hard and we're all working on it.
We're both working on it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Proud of us.
So proud of us.
So proud of us.
We are sweating.
It's so hot.
I'm sweating.
I know.
Do you see the sweat on my forehead?
Yeah. I looked at us at one point. I was like, I feel pink. She looks pink. Okay, at least we're both pink.
So we hope that after tuning into this episode that you
you feel a bit more hopeful.
Yeah. And we encourage you to think of someone in your life that you can have this conversation with. Remember, it's not everyone.
And you don't have to go out like picking fights with people. They're like, you don't, it's only when it's necessary.
Yeah. If you have someone in mind already or something has been building up, to find a way to approach it from an honest but kind and compassionate place. See what happens. Like, try not to make assumptions and just see what happens on the other side.
The easiest way to go about doing this is to improve communication with your significant other first, or like your family members. And then once you kind of build trust there, you can expand to friends. Because I think if I never had the conversations I've had with my boyfriend, I was like partner, boyfriend, significant. If I'd never had the conversations I've had with James over the 4+ years that we've been together, then I wouldn't have built up enough confidence and trust in myself to have the conversations with you. And now that I've had in my back pocket, I was like, okay, you know how it's like you have these self-fulfilling
Prophecies.
kind of, it's like, oh, if I have these conversations, it's going to be bad, so I should just never have it. Or maybe because when we were younger, we didn't know how to have these conversations, so whenever we tried, it blows up, and what you want to say never gets across the right way, and the friendship ends, and it's sad, right? So I think now that with my significant other, it's like, oh, it's actually not that bad. Like one loop completed, and then with you, it's like, oh, it actually also isn't that bad, and oh, we're still friends, great. So then that is building trust and confidence in myself to know that I can show up in a way that is constructive and not destructive, and that also with more practice you're training yourself that like, oh, this stove that I used to touch that I thought was hot actually is like a conduction oven, and it will only be hot if I'm like the material of a pan. If I come in hot and blazing, then obviously things aren't going to work out the way that you want them to, or they're like nothing's going to be solved. But if you're able to come in and approach these topics with more gentleness and kindness and compassion and empathy, then more often than not, it'll work out better than expected. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it's still uncomfortable, and that it will be uncomfortable, and that you will doubt yourself throughout the process.
Ditto. You won't know it's possible until it's possible. And once you've experienced the possibility, it really opens up the opportunities in your life to have more of those conversations. For me, it was 100% therapy. Yeah. Let's go out there and do this, guys.
And be better friends to ourselves so that we can be better friends to each other and with our partners.
Woo! Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Voice Hugs. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Instagram. You can email us, hello@voicehugspodcast.com. We also have a website with beautiful greeting cards, www.voicehugspodcast.com. Please show us some support. We love you guys.
Oh yeah, and if you like this episode, give us a 5 out of 5 stars. Leave us a good review. It's how we're able to reach more folks.
Yes.
With the good word of conflict resolution and friendship.
Woohoo! Sending everyone the biggest voice hugs wherever you are in the world. Voice hugs.
Voice hugs. Bye.
Bye.
I'm a dehydrated raisin.
I'm sweating.